Okay. The unique early Neolithic site of Göbekli Tepe near Urfa in southeast Turkey has become famous worldwide. People all over the world have come across its striking monuments and its sculptured monoliths in newspapers, in magazines, in blogs, in books, and online sites. And in all sorts of places, you can read that the monuments at Göbekli Tepe represent the world's earliest temples, and the sculptured monoliths are the first gods. As a prehistoric archaeologist working on the Neolithic of Southwest Asia, Göbekli Tepe is fascinating and at the same time problematic. But I am an academic archaeologist, and academics are fascinated by problems. But the claims for the first gods and temples make for real difficulties, and that is what I want to share with you. I'm concerned that the archaeologists' attempt to inform the public about our scientific investigations are just being submerged by the publicity-conscious dramatization of the subject into a fantasy world of commercial imagination. And I want to make it clear at this point that this lecture was planned and indeed written more than 6 months ago, before a recent symposium in Urfa, at which a major cultural heritage and tourism project for Urfa, Göbekli Tepe and the region was announced. I wasn't in Urfa for that symposium and announcement, and I've made no changes to what I planned to say 6 months ago. So here's how this lecture is organized. First, for anybody who's not familiar with Göbekli Tepe, I've got a few images of Göbekli Tepe to show you what the archaeological excavations have brought to light. And it's easy to recognize that Göbekli Tepe was a very special place with its massive architectural monuments and its very, very rich and varied symbolism. To make any sense of the site, we need some idea of its historical, cultural, and social context in the early pre-pottery Neolithic of that part of Southwest Asia. So that's the second bit of the lecture. And then we can turn to the questions of how do we get from a unique early Neolithic site with stone monuments and monolithic sculptures to the idea that these were the first temples and the sculptures representing the first gods. And as you will see, much more. As an archaeologist, I want to ask two questions, and I hope that we'll be able to discuss these at the end. I'm not necessarily going to answer them. I'm posing the questions. I would like to hear your answers. One is it possible to overcome false ideas with a true picture of the archaeology? And the second one is it possible to relate Göbekli Tepe and the early Neolithic to theories of the cultural evolution of religion? From the ancient ruins on the Acropolis at Şanlıurfa, you can get a panorama of the city. Immediately below is the cave where it is said that Abraham's mother gave birth. And there are many Muslim pilgrims who come to the mosque in front of the cave. Close by are the so-called pools of Abraham with their sacred carp. So Urfa has long been a center of pilgrimage or center for pilgrims, and now of course it welcomes tourist pilgrims who have come to see Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is located on a bare limestone ridge that overlooks the Harran Plain at the western edge, the northwestern edge of the great North Mesopotamian plain. This picture is actually taken from a little bit further east, but you can see how the hills look out onto the plain, which just disappears into the distance. When Klaus Schmidt began his excavations in 1993, this is how the site looked. A mound which is about 300 meters across and about at least 15 meters thick, dark archaeological deposits covering it. Klaus Schmidt concentrated most of his excavations on a group of 4 massive circular stone-built enclosures. This is a vertical view down into one of them. In the center of the enclosure is a pair of tall stone monoliths standing in rectangular bases carved out of the solid rock. And at the base of the circular enclosing wall, there is a stone-built bench going round. There's no doorway, and as we have to assume that access was obtained through the roof. And Klaus Schmidt's research team believed that indeed the enclosures had flat roofs. You can also see that there is another circular wall outside the inner wall. Was there once a much larger enclosure that was rebuilt on a smaller scale? or were the two walls contemporary and a corridor between them? These are only the beginnings of questions that Professor Schmidt had left unanswered at the time of his sudden and unexpected death in 2014. This is a plan of the main excavation area. The cluster of 4 circular enclosures are close to the southern edge of the mound, and the north of the excavation area, at the top of the plan here, is close to the top of the mound. The rectangular buildings at the top of the mound and on the west side of the enclosures are later than the enclosures. When they were built, the cluster of enclosures had been buried and only the tops of the central pair of monoliths would have been visible. What lies below all the small buildings around the enclosures is still not well known, except that there are small buildings all the way down to the bedrock. Before we leave this plan, I want you to notice that each of the 4 big circular enclosures has multiple walls. On this plan that they're shown as different colors and as if they are assumed to be a sequence from the dark blue outer wall to the pale blue middle wall and then the yellow inner wall. But I haven't seen any evidence that that actually is the case, is known to be the case. On this contour plan of the site, there are superimposed the results of geophysical survey. There are many more massive circular stone enclosures in different parts of the mound, and I want to emphasize that there are many difficult questions to be resolved before we could say that we understand the site of Göbekli Tepe. The site is unique, and that in itself makes it difficult to interpret. And there must be many years of careful investigation before we have the information that will enable us to understand the whole of the site. Now we can turn to the sculptured monoliths. These are 2 of the simplest ones. Each is formed from a single piece of rock. These 2 are about 2 meters tall. The largest pillars in the big circular enclosures are 5.5 meters tall and weigh several tons each. The monoliths have been shaped with stone tools, entirely shaped with stone tools. We're at the beginning of the Neolithic period, after all. And the animals that you can see, like all the images on the surfaces of the monoliths, are carved in raised relief. In other words, the surface of the monolith is planned and designed from the start. Certain animals, such as the fox and the wild bull that you see here, are relatively common images. The stone on the left, I'm going the wrong way, is covered with much more complex images. You can see a wild boar down below there, and there are some strange birds. Are they ducks or geese? And like a number of stones, the designs on this one are partly hidden because it has been set into the enclosure wall. Again, more questions. Was it originally made to be a freestanding stone and then reused in a position which partly obscured it? We're looking at the narrow edge of the stone on the right. There are 3 snakes at the top of the picture, then something that looks like a capital letter H, and below that a spider. Appearing around the edge are the heads of multiple snakes. The stone on the left of this image has an animal climbing down it, and the stone on the right is packed with puzzling images. What are those things with handles, or what look like handles at the top? There are some long-legged stork-like birds. And at the bottom, there is a vulture and, not to scale, a scorpion. And at the very bottom, a small male body minus its head. Will we ever be able to understand the meaning of all these strange symbols and how they come together? A monolith covered with a carpet of interlaced snakes. And on the right, another unique monolith with a strange, rather menacing 3-dimensional animal crawling vertically down it. That stone was photographed before the excavations had reached the rock floor of the enclosure. And now you can see it as it was intended to appear if you were standing on the floor of that gloomy roofed enclosure, lit only by the entrance hole in the roof. It has rather prominent ribs, and it looks very hungry, and its mouth and teeth show that it's some kind of fearful predator. This is one of the biggest pair of central monoliths. It's a human representation. It has fingers, you can see there on the narrow edge, and hands and arms. It wears a decorated belt with an elaborate buckle at the front. There's a picture of the lower part of it. You can see the fingers becoming hands, becoming arms, and you can see the belt going round. You can see the ornate buckle on the front edge. From that hangs something like a fox skin. Note incidentally that this massive stone was poised in its stone base. Professor Schmidt took good care to do these massive stones while the excavation was proceeding, and on the left you see the wooden frame that was put around the head of the monolith. The photograph was taken at night time so that the steel cables which held the monoliths in place were not visible. And now here's the partner. You can now see both the two central monoliths of enclosure D. Equally tall, with the same hands and arms, belt and foxskin. And like several other tall monoliths, this pair have a groove on the narrow front surface. And they also have something like a collar around their necks on which there is a pendant. Here is a close-up of the belt of one of the figures, and you can see that it is decorated with repeated capital letter H type symbols. And here are the two pendants on the two monoliths. The one on the left, again, has that capital H, a pierced disc and a crescent, and the monolith on the right has a bull's head with spreading horns. Very briefly, I want to point out that a number of fully three-dimensional sculptures have been found in the large enclosures. First, here you see a fierce animal which is sitting at the top of an enclosure wall, looking down on anyone standing on the floor. For security, all the small sculptures were taken for safe storage in the Urfa Museum, which is where I photographed that same sculpture some years ago. It had been set upright there, which makes it easier to see, again, the prominent ribs that it's showing, and the strange head, which seems to have a beak-like jaw, which encloses something like a wild boar's head. It's a very complicated, very complex image. And there's another one, again, a fierce wild animal. And another one, some kind of a wild boar. Then the most complex of all of them, and the most enigmatic, is this stone pillar, which is about 1.6 meters tall, and it was found concealed within the structure of a stone wall. Again, for security, it was immediately removed to the museum. And we have a profile picture on either side of the head-on view here. Like a number of other sculptures at Göbekli Tepe, this one was mutilated before it was concealed. At the top, there is a figure with human hands and arms, but the head with its ears looks more like that of a bear. This figure clasps the head of a second figure that has lost its face. And that figure in turn holds something that is so broken that I cannot really see what it was. What we have seen is a very complex but organized set of symbolic images. The enclosures repeat a very clearly defined design. They each contain a set of monoliths that are schematic human representations that stand in a regular pattern, 2 in the center and about 10 to 12 around the perimeter. And each monolith bears one or several images in raised relief. We mostly do not know where the three-dimensional sculptures were placed. Some repeat motifs that we see on the monoliths, while others are elements in an extended symbolic vocabulary. On the bare rock of the mountain ridge around the site, there are examples of the quarrying to obtain large stones for shaping into monoliths. Sometimes there is just a cavity from which a stone has been removed, and in these two examples, the removal has been abandoned when the stone has broken. Now, next we can look around, oh no, a little bit more first, for something of the cultural context in the region, the context from which the people who created the monumental enclosures and sculptures at Göbekli Tepe came. There are some settlements of early Neolithic date in the Urfa region, and I know that now some of these are being excavated, but I'm not making any reference to those because at the moment, till now, we have very, very little published information. Some of them also have T-shaped monoliths showing on the surface. Their relationship to Göbekli Tepe will have to be worked out through excavation. This sculpture, which is about 1.5 meters tall, was found when large-scale construction work was going on several decades ago across the road from the Pools of Abraham. Klaus Schmidt showed me the exposed strata of an early pre-pottery Neolithic settlement in the area of the urban renewal project, and that is probably where this sculpture was found. Unlike the Göbekli Tepe monolith, this figure has a definitely shaped head with a face with obsidian eyes inset. He has hands and arms, male genitals, but he does wear a collar around his neck, and how much more there is waiting to be discovered that will help to put Göbekli Tepe into context, well, we will be beginning to see in the next 2 or 3 years. At the time of the monumental enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the early pre-pottery Neolithic there are several, sorry, at the time of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the early pre-pottery Neolithic, there are several sites in southeast Turkey and over the frontier in northwest Syria that have produced small stones like these. These ones come from Jerf el Ahmar. The two upper stones have a groove on one side and incised signs on the other side, the curved surface. They're small and would fit easily into your hand. This kind of small groove stone is thought to be for the preparation of arrow shafts, and most of them are either undecorated or are decorated with a few lines. But these two shaft straighteners have motifs that we know from the monoliths at Göbekli Tepe, snakes and a vulture. The two lower stones are flat limestone plaques with motifs on both faces. And again, the motifs are recognizable. They share the Göbekli Tepe vocabulary of symbols, and similar flat plaques with incised symbols have been found at other sites and indeed at Göbekli Tepe itself. And these last two are from Göbekli Tepe. So they're telling us something of the cultural context around Göbekli Tepe. What was this cultural milieu of the early pre-pottery Neolithic around 11,000 years ago? The best example is the settlement of Jerf el Ahmar on a low hill beside the Euphrates in North Syria. The excavations were carried out by Daniel Stauder, leading a French team, when a major dam was being constructed. And this photograph was taken as the lake behind the dam was rising fast and shortly before the excavations were flooded. Jerf el Ahmar was a small settlement with a cluster of simple houses built on foundations of stone set in mud mortar. And because there was no later settlement, Daniel was able to excavate extensively across the settlement. She estimates that the total population of the settlement at any one time was somewhere perhaps 120 to 150 people. What was unexpected was the careful construction at the heart of the village of a circular subterranean building. The village existed for a number of centuries, and there was a succession of these central circular subterranean buildings, each in a slightly different place as the village shifted around the hilltop over time. This was the second in the series. At the end of its life, it was emptied, the roof was set on fire, and the cavity was filled with soil. The excavators found that the doorless cells had been used to store wheat and lentils. And what is extraordinary about Jerf el Ahmar and other settlements of this day is that they are permanent settlements occupied by a resident community of hunter-gatherers. These were not hunter-gatherers like we see on TV documentaries, living in small groups, moving frequently from place to place. They are large, permanent communities who were beginning to cultivate and harvest wild cereals and wild legumes. You've had long enough to look at this picture and notice the presence of a headless skeleton in the middle of the floor. A young woman's headless body had been thrown into the building before the roof was set on fire. And at the end of the closure ritual, the remains of the building and the remains of the young woman were buried exactly as the large-scale enclosures of Göbekli Tepe became buried. This is a reconstruction of the center of the village. Oops. I'm sorry, there we are. Oh, I'm sorry, I hope you caught a glimpse of the center of the village. I don't know why no, I don't know what's happened to it, why it keeps going away. You can perhaps just catch a glimpse of it on the left of this slide. The flat roof of the big circular subterranean building is just visible there. And then around it, there are a number of multi-roomed buildings. And each of them, like the one that's in the photograph on the right, have multiple bases for quernstones. No household would need a whole room dedicated to quernstones. And it seems likely that these buildings were in fact communal kitchens. So the circular building was communal storage. And then the processing of the wheat and the lentils was again a communal activity at the center of the village. The people living in Jerf el Ahmar were pursuing a way of life which is common to hunter-gatherers and which can be described as the ethos of sharing. And there's another of those kitchens. And then this is the successor to that big circular building that we saw, the next circular building. But now this and the succeeding one, the storage cells have disappeared. But this one has a decorated curb with carved chevrons around the stone curbstones. And then the pillars, like the one on the left of this picture, which held the roof, the stone columns which held the roof were encased in plaster. Before we leave Jerf el Ahmar, I've shown you the success, and now I want to turn attention to Klaus Schmidt. And in the 1980s, he was excavating with his professor Harold Hauptmann at an early Neolithic settlement called Novalachori in the Euphrates Valley. It was a salvage excavation ahead of the completion of the Ataturk Dam. And here is a very young Klaus Schmidt. It was the time in his career for him to set out on his own research project. And among the houses in Novalachori, there was a quite different building. Which had its floor was cut down into the ground. It has a stone bench around it and a pair of monoliths in the center. One monolith survives, the other is just a cavity. And set into the stone bench, there were more bases of stone monoliths which had all been broken and the tops were missing. The surviving monolith, there he is, looks like that, and you'll recognize the hands and arms, the groove down the center, the collar below the head, around the neck of the monolith. And the reconstruction of how that building would have looked with its monoliths complete, two in the center, and then instead of a circular enclosure, the Novalachori is a little bit later, a rectangular enclosure with about 12 monoliths around the perimeter. So that when Klaus Schmidt went to look for a site and came upon Göbekli Tepe, he was one of the very few archaeologists in the world who would have recognized that some of the stones which appeared to be poking out of the surface might be monoliths like those which he'd known from the strange building at Novalachori. Some years after the excavations had been going on and the enclosures were already becoming well known and the images of the monoliths were appearing, Klaus published a book. There was obviously pressure on him. There were so many people coming to visit the site, so many archaeologists coming and asking questions. He felt it was important to write a general book before he published any of the scientific monographs recording the excavations. And that book was called Sie bauten die ersten Tempel. They built the first temple, the mysterious sanctuary at Göbekli Tepe. There's one of the covers. It proved to be quite a popular book in German, and a lot of people read it. Yeah. I think that Klaus's book did not come entirely from his own imagination. A few years earlier, the great French prehistoric archaeologist Jacques Cauvin had produced a major publication of his life. It was entitled, in English, The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture. That's the version which I helped to produce for Cambridge University Press. The original French edition had a subtitle about La Révolution des symboles du Néolithique, the symbolic revolution in the Neolithic, which Cambridge University Press decided not to use. The first part of Jacques Cauvin's thesis was that at the beginning of the Neolithic in Southwest Asia, humans for the first time began to form ideas of a world in which there were supernatural powers. And the second part of the thesis was that these Neolithic people also began to realize that they had the power to take control of their world by taking control of the breeding of plants and animals, in other words, by farming. It was a provocative set of ideas, which is why I wanted to translate the book into English. And the French original had had a great success, selling tens of thousands of copies. But it was also highly controversial among archaeologists. It was a dangerous idea for Klaus to emulate, I think, bringing the supernatural gods and temples into the dry prehistoric archaeology of the Neolithic. Very quickly, Klaus's book was noticed. The influential German magazine Der Spiegel produced a big article. Göbekli Tepe was a signpost to paradise. On the front cover of the magazine, there are Adam and Eve, and the text proclaims the search for the Garden of Eden. Inside, the magazine's writers told researchers that archaeologists have discovered traces of an 11,000-year-old golden age of the Stone Age in Eastern Turkey, when hunters created mighty serpent temples and lived as in the Garden of Eden. The suspicion of Adam that suspicion that Adam really existed, and there is a kernel of truth at the core of the parable of the fall. The writers had done a lot of work in preparing their article, which would have been read by many tens of thousands of German readers. Only a few years earlier, a group of German research biologists had taken genetic material from some of the wild wheat that still grows in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains to the northeast of Göbekli Tepe. And they showed that the wild wheat from the Taurus foothills was the genetic ancestor of the wheats that are grown around the world today. Hence the link of the Der Spiegel writers from the people of Göbekli Tepe who were harvesting wild wheat to the Garden of Eden. Not so much a link, more of a leap of imagination. The idea of Göbekli Tepe as the place of the first temples and the first gods spread virally. But first of all, I think I can just show you a picture of the delight of some of the biologists cavorting in a field of wild wheat in the Karacadag, not so very far from Göbekli Tepe. The idea of Göbekli Tepe as a place of the first temples and the first gods spread virally, and in the present COVID-19 pandemic, we know very well what the spread of what was meant by viral spreading. I've just picked one of any number of more recent pieces of journalism. I found this one on the web. It's by an Indian journalist writing for one of the many newspapers and magazines that publish in India in English. He'd traveled to Urfa and he talked to guides and the city authorities and the representatives of the Ministry of Culture. Just look at the title of his piece, The Oldest Temple in the World. He refers to a cathedral rather than a temple, and he's learned somewhere that Göbekli Tepe is known as the 0 point in the history of human civilization. It's not just journalists. There are TV documentaries that spread the same myths, and there are professional writers of books who make a good living from telling the world that archaeologists have failed to understand the real significance of their discoveries. Here is one example. You can look up Andrew Collins on Amazon and see his various pseudoscientific publications. The paragraph alongside is what the publisher, the publisher is very shy and not showing us, there we are, tells us that the book is, he's written the definitive explanation of Göbekli Tepe. And people who follow Google Books will no doubt be very happy with that. And you can go even further. Other books, Göbekli Tepe and the spiritual matrix for the world's cosmologies. It gets pretty wild. And then one more example from a recent piece published in June this year by the highly respected scientific journal Nature. Nature published this. It's no surprise this piece is written by an independent scientific writer who was picked up on a 2019 publication about cereal processing at Göbekli Tepe by Laura and Oliver Dietrich and others, together with two other more recent relevant scientific papers on early cereal processing. That's good. And the article is equipped with all the references that we would expect on good scientific reporting. But the writer relies on the magic of Göbekli Tepe to draw the attention of readers. The mountaintop archaeological site has been described as the world's oldest temple, he says. The people who built these monumental structures were living before the Neolithic Revolution, etc., etc. I find it very frustrating and it makes me quite angry. So my first question, how can archaeologists compete? Sadly, Klaus Schmidt died suddenly and unexpectedly in 2014. He and I had won a major grant from the Templeton Foundation, and one of the elements in our plan, which I thought was probably the most important outcome of our research program, was to co-author a book about Göbekli Tepe for the general public, well illustrated from the archive material of the excavations and with the name of the excavator on the cover to give it some degree of authority. But unfortunately, it didn't happen because Klaus, as I said, unfortunately died suddenly. I think we could write about Göbekli Tepe perfectly well without getting into all this stuff about gods and temples and Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and etc. It is unique, it is extraordinary, it challenges our thinking, and it will certainly change the way that we think about early Neolithic societies. It shows that many people came together again and again to create and to reshape these great monuments, quite unlike what we expect of hunter-gatherer societies. So it's casting a whole new picture on, even before we can understand the difficult questions of Göbekli Tepe, but there's enough, I think, to talk about, which would be really interesting. Hunter-gatherers, as I say, but nothing like the common image of them, living in relatively large numbers in permanent settlements, and not simply a cluster of huts. And in that, they're not unique. There are ethnographic examples of permanent hunter-gatherer settlements. Yeah, we could change the picture of prehistory and change the understanding of the ethnographic present. They're located very cleverly in a place where there are 12 months food sources available, cultivating cereals and legumes, very sophisticated way of life. And we also know, as we've seen from the imagery, which is shared around a whole cluster of sites in North Syria, Southeast Turkey, that these communities were linked together in networks of sharing and exchange, and linked together by a common symbolism. Second question. Well, no, I'll finish that off in a little later. The second question relates to the what kind of religious ideas were current at this time 10 to 12,000 years ago. I think, first of all, it's necessary to make some preliminary observations. Anthropologists have documented the simplest rituals and religious practices and beliefs of a range of simple, small-scale societies, as well as the religions of relatively larger scale village living societies who live by horticulture and agriculturalists. We've got plenty of ethnographic documentation on the religious practices of non-modern, non-Western societies. While we generally think of religion as concerned with central importance of a god or gods, scholars who've worked extensively on the sociology of religion and anthropologists know that there are many societies whose religions make no reference to a god or gods. There's a general view that amongst anthropologists and sociologists that practice and experience are more important than beliefs and creeds, at least until recent Western times. And there is a spectrum of religions that corresponds to the spectrum of societies, from the smallest and simplest to the largest. So there is evidence, and finally, I've got one more point, there is evidence that today's great world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, have evolved from earlier religious forms within the range of ancient history, between approximately 600 before Christ to 600 of the Common Era. There is evidence for the cultural evolution of religion. Some years ago, I worked with the Australian philosopher Kim Sterelny, who is widely respected for his work on cultural evolution. Kim has gone on to study, think, and write about the cultural evolution of religion, and I'm following in his footsteps, suggesting one way which we can try to understand the evolution of religion and where the early Neolithic fits into that evolutionary process. Kim's ideas on the subject of the evolution of religion have been developed from those of a highly respected American sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah, who in turn relied on Merlin Donald's theory on the cultural evolution of human communication. Kim observes that music, storytelling, and religion are pervasive in human societies, which suggests that they are ancient and important features of human social life. Yet they are activities that don't actually seem to contribute to the basic business of living and reproducing. Music, singing and dancing, synchronized movement, and storytelling, myths, legends, parables, creation stories, are elements in all religions. But music and storytelling, of course, also exist outside religious contexts. There is a principle in evolutionary theory that evolution builds on and from existing material, and it conserves that material within each evolutionary advance. So Sterelny proposes an evolutionary sequence that begins with music and dance, which adds storytelling, and let me find my place again. And then develops ideas about a supernatural world with supernatural forces. These three stages can be observed in the anthropological literature. So among the smallest scale, simplest hunter-gatherer societies, Sterelny describes embodied religion. As societies became larger, this transitioned into articulated religion with mythologies that explain who we are and how we came to be and why this is our place. And then finally, the third stage of ideological religion. The third stage, which has appeared in some relatively recent large-scale societies, Sterelny calls ideological. Articulated religion becomes ideological religion as the narrative becomes compulsorily believed as true. And it becomes moralized. That is, there are norms of moral behavior and transgressions which may be punished by God or gods. Societies that have been successful as their religions promote, societies have been successful as their religions promote cooperation and collective action. As societies grew in size, the solidarity based on kinship, promoted in embodied religion, was no longer enough to endorse the norms that promote social cohesion and cooperation. The stories and mythology of articulated religion reinforced the solidarity of larger societies that needed to be confident of who they were, although they were not biologically related, and confident of their place in the world. Further along the evolutionary line, investing social norms with divine authorship increased their credibility and their authority. Further along again, beliefs about supernatural observation and enforcement served to increase norm compliance and promote greater social solidarity. I believe that early pre-pottery Neolithic societies were beyond the stage of Sterelny's embodied religion, dependent on music, singing, and dancing rituals. And I do not think that there is evidence that they were in the early stages of Sterelny's ideological religion. I disagree with him on that point. But powerful symbolism and imagery that we have seen goes beyond the storytelling and shared mythology of Sterelny's articulated stage. So I believe that there is an additional transitional stage between the articulated and the ideological, where the articulation becomes symbolic, material symbolic. The communities like those of Jerf el Ahmar had come together to form what I have called religious super communities, and the storytelling had to be made material in the symbolism of their architecture and imagery. The community of Jerf el Ahmar dug circular cavities 3 meters deep and 7 meters across in order to build their communal buildings. By their collective actions and in their communal buildings, they told each other who the people of Jerf el Ahmar were, and their repeated building and rebuilding showed their deep roots in that place. In the same way, Göbekli Tepe, I believe, was created and recreated by the super community, telling themselves and each other who they were, referencing their shared mythology and indicating where their true roots were. So finally, the 2 questions. Can archaeologists compete? How do we communicate our archaeological understanding to a world public in competition with authors who trade on pseudoscience and fantasy? And a second part to that question, who in fact is responsible for producing the authentic, authoritative account for the public? For example, the authoritative account of our current understanding of Göbekli Tepe. And the second question, can we archaeologists actually talk about the evolution of religion? How to engage in interdisciplinary research and publication? Religion in general is a difficult subject to talk about in public. And there I stop.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for this really amazing talk. Also very provocative in terms of some ideas which are very, very nice, stimulating. I'm sure there will be questions from our guests. I'm not a specialist on this subject, but I'm sure we're gonna have interesting questions from our guests here.